Jonathan,
Hello, Gregory.
so
Good.
great to see you.
Yeah, I'm really grateful for the invitation. This is nice.
We have students watching from various domestic households, apartments,
Yeah.
and so where are you calling in from today, Jonathan?
So I'm in my house in Claremont, California, where I teach and where I live just 4 blocks from the campus of Pomona College, where I've been, a creative writing instructor for a decade now.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is where I would still normally be living until 2 or 3 weeks more when I would usually come east. I have no idea, of course, whether I'll budge from this house soon or not for a long time. But we have crazy Southern California summer weather all of a sudden here as of the last 2 days. My 2 boys got into the swimming pool in the backyard yesterday. That was the breakthrough. So I can't complain too much.
So as we discussed, I'm going to ask you a series of open-ended questions that you could answer as you wish.
Great.
That have been compiled between myself and the students. So shall we begin?
Sure, anytime, absolutely.
What is your most vivid memory from childhood?
Oh, wow. Most vivid is a very interesting way to index them. I mean, I'll start by saying I remember a lot of my childhood. I've cultivated that kind of recollection by writing about it repeatedly, and I think I've also just been blessed with a recall. But I've worked with friends like yourself who know the time and place, which is now growing so much more distant and exotic, telling stories and etching these things into memory. So there's like, what's the involuntary vivid one, and there's what's the one that I've enshrined the most. But I guess my heart immediately went to the backyard at Dean Street,
In Brooklyn.
and in Brooklyn, where I grew up, not so far from where you grew up.
Yeah.
And I think there was the primal memory scene is like the back porch that my father had built, these heavily creosoted boards, and the French doors that opened onto it, and then the stairs down to what was really just a backyard that was rubble, because so much of that neighborhood had become a kind of a dystopian, abandoned city, and the house, the brownstone next to ours had collapsed, and its remains had not been carted away because no one would bother to cart it away. It was just sort of, they just turned over the ground. So there was like a rubble of a brownstone that was next door in this vacant lot beside our brownstone, and it was like archaeology. Walking on that ground was, there were bathroom tiles and shattered up pieces of the marble fireplace, mantelpiece, and pieces of the old newel post from the banisters. And so I was like living in one crumbling brownstone and walking around in another.
Amazing.
With my friends playing in the backyard. That's this primal scene.
It's beautiful, beautiful image. What was your first aesthetic awakening?
That's great. Well, I find I'm already speaking of like my good fortune or my luck in life. And my father is, because he's still alive and still painting, a painter. And there's no question that the origin of my aesthetic senses, which is really like a pre-conscious point of origin, was being a child in his studio, watching him paint, looking at his art in progress, his oil paintings, thinking about them, wanting to touch them or reproduce them. I mean, a lot of my baby pictures are like me drawing on a wall in his studio. And so I've written somewhere that, you know, I learned to think by watching my father paint. Certainly I learned to have an aesthetic nerve, you know, awaken in my brain by looking at his pictures.
Was his studio in the house, or was it?
It was. This is so before our family, my mother was a New Yorker. I was born in New York, but when I was a very small baby, we moved to Kansas City because my father was teaching at the Kansas City Art Institute.
Oh yeah.
And so until age 3.5, I lived on the campus in a campus building that had both his studio and an apartment that we lived in. And that's the studio. That's the first scene. But then in Brooklyn, on Dean Street in Boerum Hill, yes, his studio was always the top floor. It was very much like a psychic brain at the top of the building. It was the whole fourth level of the brownstone was his painting studio.
That was the opposite of my situation, where my father, who's a psychoanalyst, worked in the basement, subterranean.
The
viewpoint of that.
The well, or the id, or the underworld.
Do you feel like your work is autobiographical in any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's helplessly that. I think I invited this really directly when I wrote The Fortress of Solitude, my sixth novel. And I'd been, at some level, I felt consciously holding the autobiographical impulse at bay until that sixth novel. And, you know, that is the time in my life when I had moved back to New York from California, and I began to deliberately cultivate what I alluded to in answering your first question, these conversations with kids I'd grown up with, and kind of building a mosaic image of what the gentrification of Boerum Hill and Gowanus were like to live through as a child. It was such a gigantic scene of contradictions and intensities for me, things I loved and things that terrified me. And I wanted to reconstruct it in that book. So I became a kind of a self anthropologist, you know. So there I was, like, deciding I'm going to write a Bildungsroman, a confessional, autobiographical coming-of-age novel. And I wanted it to really be, I wanted to maximize that decision. So I wanted, you know, I read a lot of books like that, Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, and, you know, Another Country by James Baldwin, and Call It Sleep by Henry Roth, and all of Darce Lessing's books about coming of age in South Africa. And I was like, now it's my turn. So this is where I became an autobiographical artist. But then, conversely, when I look at the books that preceded it, where I thought I was keeping this at bay, I was like, I'm going to wait. I'm going to do other things. Those books are all about me and trying to understand myself and my life too. It just pours out of the work in all kinds of ways that I couldn't have ever controlled.
What is the least favorite part of the writing process for you? The least favorite?
Publication. I mean, you know, it's what you dream of at the start, and I still can taste some of the thrill of the desire for it, but most of what happens is so qualified and so you know, small d disorienting. It's not like trippy or exciting or you know, doesn't reveal unexpected fascinations. It's just like day-to-day undermining, discomforting, kind of unsatisfying. And the only thing you can do is write again, right, eventually, to get out of it. So the publication time is, you know, I mean, there are gratifying moments within it, but I don't care for it the way I do for making the work.
I understand that. What is the part you like the best?
Well, I really love to be in stride in the middle of a long novel. You know, I mean, I write short stories and essays and sometimes weird little things that I can blurt out in a day, like a song lyric for a friend's band, or but my deep nature, and the way I've spent the most of my adult life, even really before I was an adult, was making, I've now written 12 novels, and those are long commitments, and I love it. It's how I feel most like myself, is to be, in a way, it's a double life. I'm living in the world we're all here living in, and I'm also in this story I've made, which is, if it's any good, it's rich and strange to me too. It's like an act of discovery. The characters do things that I didn't plan, and there's spaces behind closed doors that I open up, and it's like, oh, there's a whole room there, or a whole new story there, and exploring that on a daily basis is what I live for. It's like a kind of a sublime daydream.
Tell us more about your writing process. Like, what's the day look like when you're?
Well, there's the idealization and what often actually happens. I mean, I learned at some point pretty early on that I was better, in a lot of senses, better, happier person and a more productive writer if I put it first. If I tried to write in the morning, I basically, had my coffee and got to it. And that isn't to say like a early to bed, early to rise thing necessarily. The morning might start at 11 a.m. It's whenever you wake up, but that just this prioritization, that just having it be like the first thing I really turn myself to, was really healthy. And if I could make that happen, I would. And I spent a lot of years measuring how centered I am in my work by, am I getting to it first?
Yeah.
But once you're a teacher and a parent, and with everything that goes on, you also lose the, you compromise those ideals. And so my other index is I like to work every day, at least a little. And it's really, sounds very, sounds like a lot, but it's actually often not a lot. It's often like half an hour or 45 minutes. I might write a paragraph, but the everydayness has become a real value to me. And so touching the project every day. So that militates against the morning rule, because if you miss the morning, it's like, oh, well, you blew the day. Well, no, I'll take it later on if it comes. I'll exhaust my children and put them to bed, and drink a little bit more coffee and write at 8 p.m. before I get to watch, whatever TV show I'm binge watching. And if I just work for half an hour, then the truth is I'll feel much better about myself and about my work, and I'll wake up the next day with it still in my head. And so the two facts of my writing practice are early if possible, and every day anyway. Every day, whether it's possible or not. And if I do that, I don't really have to very often concern myself with other kinds of counting or organization. Like the work piles up, even at short bursts every day. I'll write a novel in a couple of years if I follow this everyday practice.
So if you look at your life's work, if you look at the novels, the essays, the entire thing, what do you see? Do you see any sort of central themes or preoccupations that like run through it all?
Yeah, for sure. It always feels very spooky to name them as if they're simple, because if they were simple, they wouldn't be inexhaustible the way they have turned out to be. But there are two fairly simple names for things that seem to come out of every project I really give myself to, and that's, I write about loss all the time, and I write about something a little less appealing, or a little less appealing even than loss, which is culpability. I write about discovering that one is part of things that trying to hold it off or inspect or judge or get away from, and it turns out you're inside, you're enmeshed.
Yeah. Who's your imagined audience, if you have one, as you're writing or after the book is done?
Yeah, it's really, it seems like it should have a more stable or easily named. I should have a simpler answer to that question, because it's been asked of me all along, and I have feelings about it, but I also feel that it's a kind of weirdly shifty, moving target, or it's like it's a mysterious entity which presents representative faces, and almost. I mean, one thing I could say is I think I imagined myself at the height of my reading life, the discoveries that I was making when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, the way I would devour novels and stories, and the writers became these awesome presences in my psyche. It was like they just had illuminated enormous ranges of experience for me, all in a flash. And I was like, wait, there's this, and I think I write for that 15-year-old reader who's kind of a version of myself then. And to imagine that I could be revelatory that way was very humbling, very inspiring.
Yeah.
Possibility. But then, also readers present themselves and they become, like I say, visible emblems or placeholders for this mystery of who am I writing for. And so I remember certain encounters around certain specific books. With Girl in Landscape, a novel that was very important for me, well, has remained very important for me to have been able to write. There was in Wisconsin when I was on book tour. It was a very rainy night, a very quiet night on book tour. There are plenty of those where not that many people show up. There was this father and daughter that came to talk with me after I read from Girl in Landscape. Well, no, it was from a later book. Of course, it would have been a later book. I think I was maybe actually there on behalf of Motherless Brooklyn, but this teenage girl, she might have been 13 or 14 maybe, had read Girl in Landscape, and she asked her dad to go to the store that night, and she wanted to tell me what the book meant to her. And I just remember the transmission of this affect between us, where I was like, oh my God, you were who I wrote that book for. But I had to do it, and a couple more years had to go by. The book had to be an older book, and you found me on this day when that wasn't even the book I was talking about, but you brought your copy for me to sign, and now I understand why I wrote it.
Wow. Beautiful story. What work of art or film has made you cry?
I'm a soft touch, Gregory. I cry so frequently that it's shameless, and it's almost like weird for me when one doesn't, but I still like it. I was reading Ursula Le Guin novel called The Lathe of Heaven aloud to my children, and that is a definite. That's a bog of tears for me, reading aloud to my boys. I can rarely ever finish a meaningful, moving novel aloud to them without choking up towards the end. So much now that they make fun of me for it, and they'll remind me of other times, like when I got to the end of reading them The Lord of the Rings or Wind in the Willows. They're like, "Is it happening again, Daddy?" And I'm like, "Yes." Yeah.
Any movies that you could think of?
Many movies. I mean, let me think of a good example.
Lord of the Rings.
No, actually, I think those. I'm not. I don't. I went through all those films, but I wouldn't want to have to do that again. No, what's a movie that chokes me up? I mean, any Nicholas Ray movie at some point, Bigger Than Life,
Oh, I
uh,
love that.
In a Lonely Place.
Yeah.
Those are just total weepies for me.
What's on heavy rotation now, while you're in quarantine?
Well, I'm doing a thing that makes me think of you not infrequently. My partner and I are doing a systematic binge of Twin Peaks. So we're going through the first 2 seasons on Netflix. I have the disc of Fire Walk with Me, which we're going to watch in between, and then we're going to do the last, the recent return of Twin Peaks, and we're nearing the end of season 2, and that was such a piece of, I don't know what I call it, like a galvanizing sensibility token in our coming of age time, and I feel like it relates to my work, and I feel like it relates to your work, and but it's really interesting to look at it, every nook and cranny of it now.
So how does it feel looking back at it now? Like,
well, there's a lot of references that I couldn't have identified at the time, and there's also one giant overarching observation about the original TV show, which is it's so much based on daytime soap opera.
That's right.
And I don't think I'd grasped that when I watched it the first time, because it was so iconoclastic for network television. I focused totally on the surrealism and the disturbance and the horror, but an enormous preponderance of what actually goes on in it is just like he took a daytime soap opera and moved it to nighttime television and confronted an upscale television audience with the down market aesthetics of the daytime stuff. It's a really interesting piece of intervention in that way.
Makes me want to go back, and maybe I'll do it as well, to the entire series. What is your favorite guilty pleasure, if you have one?
I've always resisted the term. It seems very Protestant to me. Like, if it's pleasure, it's pleasure.
That's right.
Why do we have to drag guilt into this scene? But that said, I have some things that I know signify like guilty pleasure. Embarrassed pleasure might be.
That's a good term. I like that.
So I have recently been exposing my 9-year-old to certain prog rock talismans, but not even like the hardcore, intense, like King Crimson stuff. We've been exploring the whole Supertramp catalog right now, and those things are, speaking of heavy rotation, those things, because when he latches on, it's in a big way. We've been playing like the soup, and I have a turntable and I have the LPs, which I was lucky enough to find a used record store in Joshua Tree that had all the old Supertramp. So we have all the prime Supertramp LPs and these nice crackly, and they have these garish album covers.
Yeah.
And I've been suffusing myself in the embarrassing, almost sickly pleasure of listening to Supertramp a lot.
It's a really interesting production value on those albums, actually.
Yeah. Well, I just sort of like with Twin Peaks, when you go back, you can catch resonances or relationships that would have evaded you when you were younger, because you had very clear hierarchies of value. And I'm convinced that Supertramp's this was not what I was expecting to be discussing with you today, by the way. But I'm convinced that Supertramp's Crime of the Century was like Roger Waters' favorite record just before he made The Wall, because there are little thefts from the Supertramp all over The Wall, which, even Pink Floyd's a bit embarrassing, but that's still like, in my childhood, that was like a thing you could be wearing your sleeve. I'm into The Wall. I memorized The Wall. It's really serious art. Supertramp was like, was saccharine. But actually, I think there's a lot of connection between those two.
That is good. So what role do you feel that art and criticism plays in a time of crisis?
Well, one of the things that I has always been a marker for me. I mean, in a way, it's in this conversation, as silly as it is to be connecting this to Twin Peaks and Supertramp. But the I grew up going to used bookstores and reading out of print authors, and um, you know, uh, I was very much unconcerned. It began with a sense of unconcern with the idea of art as uh, breaking news. The idea of the contemporary, or what's the current phrase that we're all thinking about right now because we're doing online teaching, is synchronous versus asynchronous connection to things, right? The idea of art as like kind of a newspaper, a synchronous event, like, oh, you know, Fiona Apple just dropped her record and now we're all going to listen to it because it's the now. I mean, it might be great, but it might be equally great to discover something that dropped, quote unquote, 20, 30, 100 years ago. The nourishment, the connection, between me and those authors that I was mentioning when I was a teenager, I wasn't going to, Barnes and Noble and buying brand new books. I was reading old dusty paperbacks. I might have been the only person reading, Richard Brautigan's In Watermelon Sugar, on that day in 1982 that I was reading it and having it blow my mind. It was out of fashion. It might have even been out of print, so I tend to foreground for myself this idea. It's almost like, that the girl in Milwaukee, the reason that was a great connection was that she wasn't interested in the book that I was supposed to be hyping on that book tour. It was one of my earlier ones, and that made it a much more real, individuated kind of encounter. So I think often about like finding things or relocating things that are already trying to speak to you, that are sitting there lying in wait, as much as I do about like gestures of connection with like some brand new published essay or story or novel that's going to sort this moment all out for us, And so for myself, I also tried not to think about like, I've got to weigh in, I've got to be heard from, I've got to be relevant. It seems like that's such a death trap. That's for a newspaper to worry about. Instead, I just am going to stay lurking around inside my own deep intuitions and inclinations, and try to make something that matters to me to make, and let its any question of relevancy, or let alone like commentary, synchronous commentary, be just not a question.
Bookstores and record stores. I'm seeing a theme here.
Yeah.
The final question then from me, and then if we have time, you're up for it, we could have students ask a few.
I'd love to take a few. That'd be great.
What advice would you give the students in this moment of peril?
Speaking with my own students and working with them in these virtual classes, I just constantly humbled to be aware of my advantageous position by being this, decrepit older person who has other kinds of experiences to index and console myself with. I think it's a ridiculous and terrifying situation to be a college student right now. My heart is crushed for my students a lot of the time, and that's not because they're being pathetic and tugging on my sleeve and complaining. They're actually being remarkable and doing really incredible work in some cases that I just couldn't have imagined they were going to do under these circumstances. But I guess I have banal thoughts to offer, and I do think that this will change and pass and modulate, and you have to wake up every single day and hold on to that. And then at the same time, it's like looking for not the silver lining, but the opportunities for uh, uh, reflection and deepened connection, even within the paradox of all of this disconnection and remote connection. It's a study. It's a time that's going to be unforgettable and emblematic in your lives, the way very little, I don't know what you, Gregory, feel are the kind of earthquakes of your coming of age. Everyone has them, but very rarely are they so global, transcendently universal.
Yeah, I agree.
They're usually more intimate.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Well, with that, let's open up to some questions. I think Nabil has a question. Are you there?
Oh, yes. Hi.
Hey.
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. I appreciate it. I was wondering if you could talk to us about maybe particular photographers or filmmakers or artists who work with narrative in visual ways that really inspire.
Great.
Good question.
That's marvelous. Yeah, well, so I alluded to the fact that I grew up, even before, like I say, in a pre-conscious way, inside an artist studio. And my first life as my first creative impulses were all, I thought, my father's a painter, I'm going to make paintings or drawings. And I did it as a kid, just almost as second nature. And I, as my interest in story and narrative developed, I latched on to forms that melded the visual and the narrative. I was really into film, and I was crazy for comic books. And I also really liked, sometimes, Gregory asked me about like guilty pleasures. One of the things that, like, my father is a painter of his generation. He is a painter of his generation. He's very painterly. He made expressionist, brushwork, and the idea of the painterly was very important to him. But when I was developing my own index of like what I liked and what I was into, along with science fiction and animated films, I liked surrealist paintings, and I liked really hard-edged literal ones like Magritte and Dali. And my father was like, really made me feel terrible about that. He was like, those guys are illustrators, they're not painters. And my taste has sort of evolved out of, especially Dali. I still kind of have a weakness for Magritte, but I have a very, very strong responsiveness to image makers, people who make wall art, where it's deeply of its medium, but also has narrative implication. In some way, it suggests like a story or a language, a storytelling language that wants to escape the wall, the static image, and become a story. So like De Chirico was my favorite painter. In many ways, it maybe still is my favorite painter. And then I also experienced this resonance very powerfully with like the second half of Philip Guston's painting life. All of those crazy Klansmen in cars with cigars, suggested to me this volcanic narrative implication. The paintings themselves seem to be windows into a world of story and character and language that meant a lot to me. And you could probably see where I'm going, which is I'm going to blow some smoke up Gregory's butt right now and say he does this. He makes these images that are fantastically grounded in the photographic medium, and they're alive in every sense that you want a visual artifact to be alive, but they also seem to cry to be understood as fragments of or windows into narrative possibility. And I just love that. I just can't stop, so when I like choose art to live with, it usually has some of that potential that if I were trying to make paintings and drawings or photography or sculpture, I'm sure it would have that same desire, that I would be reaching for that same kind of result. But in a way, I threw over the visual part of it, and I just decided I'm going to make the images happen inside the reader's mind's eye. You know, I'm going to focus on the story and the character and the language, the movement through time that is possible in my chosen medium instead.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the question. It was really good.
Muted here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
I was going to say, I'm going to isolate that and use it as a blurb if you don't mind. Your company.
Sure. I don't know which bit, but
on my work.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Ron Wei.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
I have a question. I'm not sure it's right or not. I'm just thinking about what's the relationship between your novel and the movie, between your novel, like the Motherless Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, do you find the similar image or some place like in my mind and also in the Edward Norton's mind?
Yeah.
Do you find some, maybe when you write this novel, you find, oh, the director is the same idea, the same image in your mind. So I just think about what's the difference between the photos in your mind and in director's mind.
Yeah, well, this is a great question, and it opens to a whole area of my experience, both as a film goer, as a movie lover, and as this weird recipient of the adaptation, which is, I mean, first of all, it's really important to notice that is my position. It's a really charged and interesting one, but it's a very passive situation. I didn't write the screenplay, and I didn't even really advise Edward Norton on the decisions. I gave him permission and opened the door by saying I wanted him to make whatever film he wanted to make, and then I became this recipient. And it's also the context for that experience, which took 20 years from when I wrote the book to when he actually produced a finished result with a film. So I'm very distant from the person I was when I wrote Motherless Brooklyn. But I also, in those intervening years, have a whole bunch of other experiences which are invisible ones, which is filmmakers trying to make some of my books into films over and over again. And so being drawn into the envisioning, like, what would it be like? How would you do it? What would your choices be? How would it change? So Motherless Brooklyn by Edward Norton is the only example I have of one of these discussions, one of these possibilities coming to light. But I've actually been involved in a kind of virtual relationship to what would the results be. There were some very lively, marvelous projects that didn't come to be. David Cronenberg almost made a film of a book of mine called As She Climbed Across the Table. And, I still wake up days and I just think about what would the David Cronenberg movie of that book have been like. Edward Norton let me know very early on that he wanted to change fundamental things about that book. And they bear upon the basic image structures. When you talk about it from a visual perspective, he wanted to set it in the 50s. I'd set the book in the time it was written, in the late 90s. And that changes everything. And in a way, what he did was he translated my pretend detectives into real ones, and he changed my pretend film noir into a real film noir. I sometimes look at that movie and I think, oh, this is because my characters are bozos who have a dream life. They walk around contemporary Brooklyn and they pretend they're in a black and white movie about gangsters and detectives, but they're not really in one. So it's like he made the movie that they would have liked to have made about their lives. He took them at their word. And it's really great. It's like a whole other fantasy that's been grown out of the minds of my characters. But to answer your question in the simplest possible way, no, I'm not a film director, but had I become one and I'd made a film based on the same materials, it would have looked different 100 different ways. I mean, it would have been very nervous, black and white, kind of verite mixed with weird fantastical things. I mean, it might have looked like Darren Aronofsky's first movie, Pi. Yeah. If I'd made Motherless Brooklyn, that would have maybe been a visual reference for it.
Great answer. Jackie? Do we hear you?
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, Jackie.
I have more of just a general question, but I'm curious to know what's an unexpected source of inspiration for you?
Unexpected source of inspiration. I mean, there's probably a lot that would seem unexpected to people who only read my books, and because I read a lot of novels that are not the kind that people tend to group my books with. Like, people tend to push my books into a pile, understandably, of like other smarty pants white guys, and so people are always like looking for the Pynchon resonances, and sometimes there are some of those. But I like a lot of mid 20th century, often British or anyway United Kingdom woman novelists a lot more than I like Thomas Pynchon. So I'm like frequently trying my hardest to write like Iris Murdoch or Barbara Pym or Doris Lessing, or Muriel Spark. These are just writers that I obsess over and think about all the time, but no one ever like looks at my books and is like, oh, look at him trying to be Iris Murdoch. It's totally invisible. So that would be unexpected, I think, to most people, but maybe not so unexpected to me, because it's very deliberate and it's conscious engagement. I'm always excited to think about those writers and to reread them or discover new writers that I associate with that kind of stylistic, that kind of commitment. Penelope Fitzgerald, I came to relatively recently. But unexpected to me would be an even more interesting question to try to answer. I think that the thing that surprises me when I spot it, but it happens so often, is the influence of books that were children's books that I didn't think I even liked as a kid. But then I see like I'm doing like some element of them, or I'm still thinking about them at some deep level of my narrative, the narrative patterns in my head. I'm reproducing like what seemed to me inconsequential kids' books at the time, but I must have been such a sponge that their imprint on me was really much bigger than I realized.
Mickey?
Hi, thank you for being here. This is kind of a runoff off of the last question you just answered. And yeah, in the spirit of kind of the lightheartedness of this conversation, I guess I was wondering if you have any opinions on the writing of Carrie Bradshaw.
I'm not familiar with Carrie Bradshaw's writing. I'm so sorry. I would love to rise to this occasion and have a really great thing to say, but I'm totally helpless.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, because she is someone, I think her writing style is somebody that like I can't get out of my head.
That's great. I love that.
If like real writers in any way have any opinion.
I'm sure there are some, and I wish I was that person for you. But
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep searching. Thank you.
I'm drawing a total blank on that one, but that's cool. That's a great question.
Okay.
Jonathan, what are you working on now?
Well, I got kind of lucky, I think, probably, for a novelist who writes things that take him years to write, in that I had just finished a book in February, and I'm in like copy edits on it, and it's going to be published in November. So I didn't have to deal with this disorientation, dismay, stimulation, whatever crazy bundle of things, the onset of the COVID world and the quarantine world would have meant for writing a novel if it had come in the middle of the process. Mm-hmm. I mean, I might have just stopped for a couple of months in confusion and then gone back and finished a project according to its pre-existing plan, but it would have been a strange thing to have it land in the middle of a long project. But I was done. So I'm mostly letting myself do things that are small gestures, and sharing gestures seem to mean a lot. Like we spoke of bookstores earlier. There are a number of bookstores that I treasure, like Spoonbill in Sugartown, and Moe's in Berkeley, that are in crisis. City Lights in San Francisco. And I've been like writing things for their websites to help them with GoFundMe campaigns, and that just feels good. And I'm trying to write a couple of short stories. I had promised myself for years. I promised myself that I would get back to writing some short stories. It's, you know, I'm predominantly a novelist, but I used to do more exceptions, more short stories, and I'm kind of missed it. So I was like, I'll write some short stories now. That'll keep me alive, and you know, if I bite off a smaller portion of work, it might be more comfortable right now anyway. And I have the teaching and parenting to do, and just figuring out how to get groceries. So I'm trying not to be too hard on myself about like announcing a brand new project. It's like I say, it's lucky that I have a book coming out, so I can rest on that sense of laurels a little bit.
Well, we look forward to that. Do we know what the title is yet? Or
yeah, it's called The Arrest.
Oh, nice.
Which makes it sound like a crime novel, but it's actually not a crime novel. It's kind of a gentle, near future, post collapse book. So maybe also has some resonance with the current situation, but it's also like the opposite of the current situation, because in my book, in The Arrest, there's the internet is one of the things that gets arrested and goes away, and so there's no remoteness. There's only locality. There's like just being with who you're with in a small town.
Oh wow, that sounds amazing and much needed.
Well, maybe, I don't know. You know, it feels vain to imagine what's needed right now and have the answer be my book, but.
Well, on that note, Jonathan, thank you so much. I want to ask all the students if they could put on their screens and their audio, and thank Jonathan with a round of applause. This has been so wonderful.
It's great to see you all.
Thank you.
It's okay to do that.